And joining us now is Chris DeVito. He's Director of Research for Iran180. Chris, I'm sure you would like Iran to do a 180 with its nuclear program, right?
Absolutely. I mean, that is, part of our theming. It's also not just the nuclear issue. We're also concerned with human rights. But as you indicated, the Obama administration is pushing the International Atomic Energy Agency, the UN watchdog group that's focused on nuclear issues, to release some sensitive information that is clearly indicating that Iran is pursuing a nuclear weapon, not simply a civilian nuclear program as they claim.
And do you think they'll be successful? What do you think? How do you think the UN, knowing sort of how the UN works, do you think it will release this? Because some people have come out from the UN and said, gosh, if they do this, then it'll shut the doors for any inspectors to go in, even if it's narrow in their insight into what's happening, at least they get some access. Will this totally close the door? Is this really not the way to go?
I mean, I think there is always a cost to any course of action. But the reality is I think that we're well served by the current head of the IAEA, Yukiya Amano. He has proven more willing than his predecessor to kind of take a harsh look at Iran's weapons program.
He's come out and said that he's concerned that inspectors could be ejected.
Sure. I mean, he may be concerned about that, but he has also issued, I think, much more harshly worded diplomatic statements than we ever saw under his predecessor regarding the increasing concerns of the IAEA about Iran's nuclear program.
And do you think it's time to get tough with Iran? What's your sense from studying this, Chris?
Well, I mean, I think that, the real problem here is bringing the international community on board with our continuing efforts to isolate the Iranian regime. We have cooperation from our European allies. I think as we've experienced in the past, the difficulty is going to be bringing Russia and China along in terms of enforcing any robust international sanctions that will actually affect the Iranian regime's behavior on these issues.
And will China and Russia ever get on board? Is there anything that they would ever approve in terms of against Iran?
I think that, that's a harder question to answer. I mean, I think that there is some space. We saw recently that the Chinese abandoned a large oil and gas project that they were pursuing with the Iranians. I think it's a matter of figuring out how we convince them that their interests are also aligned with ours in preventing Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. I mean, I think that the reality is that this is not simply an issue that should concern the United States. It's one that is genuinely of international concern, and the Chinese and the Russians need to be brought around to that opinion.
And can they ever get around to that opinion? I mean, it seems like it's like every time we get so close on doing stuff, it's always Russia and China that says, no, we're not going to support it. And also Germany with some things, too.
Yeah, well, I mean, the challenge is that both of these countries have economic, commercial, and strategic interests that are aligned with Iran's in some respects. I think that, there are certain courses of action that the United States can pursue that make doing business with Iran more costly for international actors and, other international firms, and that includes Russian and Chinese businesses.
Yeah, what can we do? What can we do to those, to say, okay, well, let's make it so difficult they have to acquiesce?
Well, I think, one of the things that's being discussed openly now is sanctions on Iran's central bank. This is one of the courses of action that could potentially, affect the calculus of other international actors when it comes to doing business in Iran. The other is targeting the petroleum industry in Iran. As we know, Iran is a major international producer of petroleum products. According to the Energy Information Agency, run by the U.S. Energy Department, they are the fourth leading producer of petroleum products in the world. And this would certainly affect the ability of the Iranian regime to raise money. The fact is that the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, of which the Quds Force is a part, does have a major role in Iran's petroleum industry. So targeting specific facilities and companies that are run as subsidiaries of the Quds Force or of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps could be an effective way of limiting, the action that they can take abroad.
And I want to talk about those actions when we come back, Chris. Also, the other thing for our listeners when we come back, I want to have you describe sort of who are these Iranian Quds Force. Again, sure. These are the guys who authorities here in the USA tried to recruit a Mexican hitman to kill the Saudi ambassador, Adel al-Jubeir, on U.S. soil. So who are these guys? How did they get to the U.S.? And also, what's their sort of role in Iran? We're going to talk about all that, Chris. When we come back, everyone, stay with us here on The Rita Cosby Show.
800-321-8828.
And this is Rita Cosby here on The Rita Cosby Show. We are taking your calls, 1-800-321-8828, 1-800-321-8828. And we continue to talk about new plans by the U.S. to pressure the UN to release classified information showing that Iran is designing and experimenting with nuclear weapons technology, contrary to what it has been saying for years. The U.S. is saying, look, if the UN can release this information, it would continue to put pressure on Iran, continue to isolate Iran. And they believe, as many of us, and I believe that's critical, especially after this new plot that was unveiled showing a Texas used car salesman allegedly directing members of Iran's Quds Force to recruit a Mexican hitman. It almost seemed like a scene out of a movie to kill the Saudi ambassador Adel al-Jaber, who I know, who I interviewed many times when I was senior correspondent at Fox News. And this plan is just amazing and staggering that it sounds like the Quds Force was planning on doing it, again, on U.S. soil, involving U.S. embassies. This is our territory, and planning on taking out a key Saudi figure. Of course, it did not happen. It was infiltrated by the FBI and others. But what does all this mean? We're continuing with Chris DeVito, Director of Outreach for Iran180. And Chris, you have great insight into Iran. What describe this Quds Force like? What is it, and how does it work, and why is it maybe such a threat?
Sure. So the Quds Force, as I alluded to earlier, is a part of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is essentially the regime protection unit of the Iranian military. These are the people who are dedicated to supporting the revolutionary structure of Iran's government. The Quds Force was formed in the wake of the Iran-Iraq War in the mid-'80s or late '80s, really to export the revolution as a tool for the Iranian government to kind of export their own brand of kind of religious and political radicalism throughout the Middle East. Since then, they've moved further afield into Latin America, and as we saw this past week, into the United States as well.
And how much of a threat is it, I guess, to the U.S., and what is sort of their ideology, if you will? Are they some of the more extreme?
Well, certainly, up until I think this past couple of weeks, they've had the reputation as being a highly skilled, if politically radical and dangerous organization. I think that as we saw from this kind of 24-esque plot that was revealed by the Justice Department this past week, they're maybe not as skilled and maybe a little bit more bumbling than we thought in the past.
Yeah, and by the way, can you believe it? Like you said, I mean, at first it seemed like a scene out of a Hollywood play, a scene out of 24. And in a way, it did seem bumbling that they would be able to say, okay, we're going to go with this Mexican group. We're going to use some used car salesmen. It didn't seem like they used the most sophisticated players. Is that a sign that maybe they're not as sophisticated or not as organized as we thought?
Yeah, I think it certainly may be. I mean, I think that, ineptitude is never indicative of not ill will. I think that, them not choosing the best candidates to pursue this plot doesn't necessarily mean some people have taken it to insinuate that maybe that they weren't actually behind this effort. I don't think that we have any reason to believe that they were not. No evidence has been given to the contrary. I just think that it means, these people are human as well, and, sometimes their plans are not as well laid as one would imagine them to be.
Well, thank God they were not as well laid in this case. And Chris, thank you so much for being with us, Director of Outreach for Iran180, Chris DeVito.